Okay, so welcome back to Soundbites, show about good people doing good things in the local food and drink industry. And I'm really excited today because we have Alan Stewart from Horton Ridge. And if you haven't heard of Horton Ridge, you should because it's a unique and interesting story and adds a layer to the local food and drink scene. Um, so welcome, Alan, and I'm happy to talk to you because this is very exciting what you do.
Great to be here.
So you produce malt, so one that's interesting. You have a brewery, and I understand that you now have a kind of like a beer garden or something, a hospitality space too for people to enjoy.
That's
But
correct.
that's not your history, is it? I mean, uh, before brewing and malting, what were you doing, or what was on the property, the space? Like, are you?
Well,
Tell us a bit about your farming background.
the malt house and right, the malt house sits on our farm property, and you should give a $25 bonus to any of your listeners that actually know what malt is. And
Yeah,
so
well,
anyway,
we'll get
I
you to explain.
sixth generation farmer in on the farm here in Hortonville. Yes. So as I got a little older, I bought the farm from my dad. It was a typical mixed farm, as most farms were in his day. And then during the latter half of his career and the early part of my career, farming started to become specialized. And the eventual winners of that model are the chicken and the dairy businesses. Anybody that was in any of the other businesses, mainly pork and beef, didn't fare so well. So we were on the pork and beef side of things, and the farm was starting to come to a logical conclusion, as many small farms did in the valley. And so I ended up going to university and engineering school in particular, and got uh, lots of engineering degrees. And as my father said, more degrees than a thermometer. But I decided to stay here and try to keep the family name on the mailbox at the end of the driveway, trying to keep the farm alive. And I was one of the first organic farmers in the province. And I've been farming organically ever since. That was 30, getting close to 40 years now. So as I got a little longer in the tooth and a little later in my career, I decided I wanted to be a grain farmer. Growing grain is probably one of the more easy things to do as a farmer. It puts you in that gentleman farmer category. The needs are quite small. You plant in the spring, grow all summer, harvest in the fall, and take the winter off. So if I was going to grow grain, I needed something to do with the grain. And at the time, craft beer industry was exploding. And as we all know, beer is made from grain. So I thought that might be a possible connection. However, what I didn't know, and what most people don't know, is grain needs to be malted first before it can be used in making beer. So not if I wanted to service the beer industry and using local grain, then somebody had to close that gap with a malt house. So the malt house is a connection between brewing and agriculture.
So for those that don't really know what malting is and why it's important to fermentation, maybe we could give the Coles Notes version of what
Yes.
malt is, because it is the core. It's such a it is well, you can't make it without. So what is malt? If you gave me the Coles Notes.
Actually, it's very simple. Grain. In order to make alcohol, you need sugar. Most commonly known products, grapes, apples, come with sugar. So you just use those as they are. Grain is full of starch, so it has no sugar. However, when grain germinates, sugars are created. So it's that simple. All malting is a process of germinating grain to the degree that allows those sugars to become available so that the fermentation can happen. Pretty simple.
And
Lost you
we
there
know
for a
that
minute.
and we know that most people you look at beers, they're of different colors, different, and the malt contributes different flavors. Same with
Yes.
whiskey. So, as much as you say, I know you say it's a fairly simple process, but I'm sure in when you actually go to do it, not as simple maybe as just steeping, putting in water, letting it germinate, and then drying it out. I'm sure there's a few other things that go that complicate it, I'm sure.
Oh, of course. There's lots of variables, and that you have to have good grain. You have to have a good process. You have to follow that process. Attention to detail, like everything. It is a living thing as it's germinating. So, as a farmer, you're used to that concept of having living things under your care that you have to monitor around the clock. And malt is germinating grain is one of those. And then, as far as your points around the things that malt bring to beer, the number one thing is color and flavor. Of course, hops are used to counter the sweetness of the malt. Beer without hops would be probably a little too sweet for the average Joe. And but predominantly, the number one ingredient of malt by a long shot, other than water, of course, is malt. Hops and yeast are 100 or 1,000 times less plentiful in beer.
And we should say too, malt is not just generic. Like there, you also have different grains. So if
Yes,
my
yes.
understanding is correctly, on the farm originally was rye, is and then I assume you've expanded to include barley, and what other grains do you grow?
Yeah. Many grains can be malted and beer can be made from them. Right now I grow predominantly wheat and some barley. But barley is the most commonly malted grain by a long shot. So every beer, 99.9% of beers would have barley in them. A wheat beer would have, say, 80% barley, 20% wheat. That's what makes it a wheat beer. A wheat beer is not 100% wheat. There's always barley.
Mm. Right, and so yeah, so all that have their individual characteristics, all have their probably individual challenges too. I always think of like
Yep.
rye and whiskey, and some distillers find it a little challenging. I think it can be a little difficult in it sometimes to work with, but giving that nice kind of spiciness to whiskey, which we love. So obviously you grow a lot.
Well, the big
Yep.
I just make a point on that. It's a physical thing. The reason why barley is used more often than any other grain, barley has a husk on it, whereas rye and wheat do not. It's the presence of that husk, which is a totally inert part of the barley that adds nothing to the malting, the flavor, or anything to do with distilling or brewing. But its physical presence during the process allows the water to drain through the mash
Mm,
better than a grain that doesn't have a husk. So that's the
right.
challenge of rye and wheat. You get a more of a gummy
Right, and that
sludge
and
that
that's what I've
it
heard
was
about from some distillers, that rye can be hard on their equipment or hard to manage,
exactly.
for that very reason. So, okay, so then you make the decision to go from malting. You made the malt, but now you do a brewery. I
Yeah.
think it's a great statement in the Annapolis Valley, where we have for the better part of almost 40 years had wineries, a varying number of them during that time, but uh, where we really think about grape to glass, and you're kind of doing grain to glass, which is kind of amazing. I think that's a wonderful addition to our industry, to have you there doing a real transition, where we're on a farm, and and we have others that are doing great things, like Big Truce is a great example too, but um where you're taking it from stage one to the glass. So when did the decision happen to make a brewery?
Well, it came a year or so after. To be frank, this started off as a whiskey project, as you can imagine. I wanted to
Mhm.
do an organic estate rye whiskey. We're still waiting to pull the trigger on that. The operation of the malt house became a full-time job, so the whiskey project had to take a back seat. And brewing is a far easier business to get into than distilling. So it was a fairly easy decision to move into brewing as opposed to distilling. And so we opened a brewery year two after we've been for a year, and then we opened a small brewery, and we've been expanding that ever since.
Yeah, no, I think one of the exciting things too is now that you're adding a new dimension to the Annapolis Valley and that idea that, a lot of people go to the valley with food and drink in mind. And
Mhm.
obviously, like I said, for 40 years, 40 years, we've had wine as a primary, but now we have cideries.
Mhm.
That have customer experiences. So now you too have kind of a strong a customer experience too. That in that
Right.
if I haven't been there yet, but I understand is there like a beer garden or something of that nature there, or an out? I heard a lot of locals like going to Horton Ridge for a beer. So how when did that come about, and what's that all about?
Well, the first of all, one of the things, there are a couple of things about Horton Ridge that make it fairly new. We're in a very rural setting, and that is unusual in Nova Scotia to have, in this day and age, to have a pub out in the middle of on the edge of a very small community. It's more of an English model or European model where every town has a pub or two. So we filled a gap there within our community, and we attracted a lot of locals and a lot of new people to the area. And this part of Kings County, or this part of the valley, has experienced quite a population boom over the last couple of years. It's becoming a very desired place to be, from largely due to the reasons you've just mentioned. So we became more of a neighborhood pub versus a typical winery or cidery that's geared to bring a large number of people in, process them through tastings, and send them on their way.
Mm.
So we do have a real neighborhood pub
That is
feel to
totally the
us, and it's typical to come in and you'll always run into somebody and we're we're located next to the 101. We have a very distinctive looking building. I don't know if you've ever seen our building or not,
yeah,
but
of
it
course, yeah.
stands out. And the location is, we look over the mouth of the Gaspereau Valley, so that we have a nice outside location. So that's very helpful in inspiring people to sit there and drink in the view.
Yeah, well, I certainly that's the reputation you have, is that it's all about locals, and I think you probably get more than a fair share of winemakers that hang out there for a beer, because that's the impression I get from that community. So, I mean, I think it's an exciting project. I think what you do in terms of getting granted, that's just absolutely amazing for our industry. Is there any innovation coming down the line that you could let us know about, or is there anything new that we should be thinking about when we think about Horton Ridge?
Well, this whiskey thing keeps popping up every once in a while, and it's interesting. Then on the other side of that, there's our physical location has inspired a lot of people wanting to come for and do events. So we've always, over the last couple of years, had conversations about expanding our event venue and taking advantage of our natural setting more. So between those two things and just growing the business, our business is growing fairly nicely over the last couple of years, despite all the challenges we've had. We've been very pleased with that. So it's it's a question of keeping the ball rolling the way it is and having an eye on one or two possible things down the road. We haven't made any firm decisions about either of those two projects yet, but I'm assuming that that'll happen. And there's also, I'm getting a little along in years, and my son now runs most of the day-to-day operations. So you might look to him for the dreams and the reality,
Right.
making those real.
So that's Connor, I assume.
That's right. That's right.
Yep. Okay. So how does one find Horton Ridge beer? So is it only sold at the location, or is it distributed elsewhere as well?
Mainly at our location. We are not in the government outlets.
Yep.
Several of we have, service Lightfoot and Wolfville. Luckett's have our beers on tap. Longfellow, it's a new version of an old restaurant in Grand Prairie, carry our beer. And that's fairly strategic for us. We're small enough that we can't make the model of running beer through the liquor stores work for
Yep.
us. And so we just typically have tap accounts that will drive people to our location. So they're close to us. The servers in the industry know who we are, so they could be put in that direction. Because to be honest, and I think anybody in the industry will tell you, the most profitable beer is the one that you're pouring out of your own tap in your
Of
own
course.
barn. Yeah,
Yep, we've been selling that story a lot on the show lately. It's really important for Nova Scotians to understand how important it is to go to the location to buy product,
right.
to support small business owners to make the full margin, because it becomes a very tight margin business when you're not purchasing right at the property. So, Alan, I think great story for the Nova Scotia food and drink landscape. I really appreciate your time, and I think I'm sure a lot of people have driven by your property and not totally, not known to go in, but I think it's such a beautiful place that I definitely have to go in next time. So I'm up actually. I might see me tomorrow because I'm up doing a judging of wine in the valley tomorrow. So anyway, I think it was just a great pleasure to have you, because I think it's amazing what you accomplished and done.
Well, thank you
So
very much, Mark.